Ladies and gentlemen, Brian is scratching his head. Welcome to After Service.
Good evening, everybody. Yeah, that'll be a good clip for the YouTube channel. Yes.
Yeah.
So good morning and evening or whenever it is you happen to see this, and I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see you, Joe.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
And you as well. I don't mean that facetiously.
No, I know. It's we live like 40 minutes away, at least
About
probably.
a half hour. I don't know. It's 18 miles from here to the church, which is about 25 minutes if traffic is okay.
Still 30.
Yeah.
30, because it's about 7 minutes from our house to the church. So if you cut the corner, 30.
Yeah.
Still, I don't get to just go hang out with you. So this is our chance to hang out a little bit.
This is hangout time. So those of you who want to watch us hang out, so welcome to After Service.
After Service, where we talk about the Bible as we're trying to figure out what it means and how to follow Jesus. I like that tagline. That's a good tagline, I think.
You should write it down. It's a good thing it's being recorded. You can go back and write it down later. The timestamp is 2:40, just in case you want to go back and find that.
Yeah. Figuring out what the Bible means and how to follow Jesus. So, anyways, it's cold. It definitely has turned to fall / almost winter.
Yeah. It didn't take very long for that to turn. It's like a week and a half. We went from soccer being kind of rain-free to, it's wet and kind of cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago. We had an 80-degree day, I think.
No, well, let me see. We had like 3 weeks ago was when we did the disc golf thing, and it was like 70 something degrees outside. It was lovely.
Yeah.
But it makes
and now it's low 40s. So, and maybe snow next week. It won't happen. Weathermen are always wrong in Oregon.
Well, it's not like they have much of a chance.
No. I mean, if you know, it's really difficult to predict the weather in Oregon. There's too many variables. They do their best, but as people joke, it's the only job you can be right 90% of the time and still keep your job.
Well, 90% would be a good number for them, right? And it's not meant to be disparaging. It's just,
It's true.
I imagine being a weather person in like Phoenix would be about the most boring job ever because it's so. I mean, what's the temperature?
Same every day. Or Hawaii, right?
Right. Well, Hawaii at least gets some rain. I mean, there's quite a bit of rain in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, this has got to be incredibly boring for people, but
as we talk about the weather.
Yeah. Well, the All Weather All the Time podcast.
Yeah. Anyways, okay, so I guess we're going to be talking about this week Genesis, and because 2 weeks ago, this last week, you did a lovely, really good worship service. A lot of people enjoyed it, and I think it was really good to hear you tell through story the point that you really need to hear people's whole story. That there's more to the story for people, and just listen. And was that not the point?
Yeah, and actually, something I said after the fact to you might even be more the point. Just a finer point, which is, I talked about my dad and learning about him throughout his life, even though he was my dad. I was incredibly close to him, and I considered him one of my best friends. As we grew into that, child-parent relationship into the latter part of his life. But I was still learning things about him. And how much more effort do we need to put in to get to know people that we aren't as close to?
Right.
And how easy it is to just be dismissive of other people, or to hear one story and extrapolate and assume that means the whole story. It's that it's an investment. I am so guilty of that, of being judgmental. Mm-hmm. So it's very convicting to me, especially as we personalize our interactions with people, which is natural, right? It's like, how I'm going to respond to it the way I do, but ultimately me centric. How do I
Right.
feel about that? How do I respond to this? And it's harder to be empathetic and to go, I wonder what they're going through. I wonder why they're responding this way.
To get out of you and think about them. Yeah.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy. And you know, as a pastor, how exhausting that can be.
And how rare it is for
Yeah.
someone to do that for me.
Yeah. It's
It's true.
that's part of the
Yeah.
reason, like when I thought about becoming a priest when I was younger, that amongst many other things, but even as I considered kind of a pastoral role, it was like I know how exhausting that is and how easy it is to grow resentful. Where, like I said at the beginning, we want to feel known, and if it's your job to know people, at some point people need to pour into you and know you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I got a great congregation, and I appreciate them. And people do ask. They do genuinely want to know how I'm doing, which I appreciate. But to finish that, I just had that point. I just had a quote I wanted to share. Is a wise man said that people are very strange and interesting, and if they're not to you, then you're not paying attention,
Yeah,
because they
sure.
really are very different than your experience. They're the way they look at the world, the way they think about stuff, the way they process issues. They're very, very different than you. And if you don't find them strange, you're really not listening to them.
Yeah, I
Which I
I
thought, huh.
I really benefited from a number of years of doing an interview show, and it's an interesting muscle to kind of develop, to sit with somebody and never be at a lack of something to talk about because you're asking them about them. And it's, where'd you grow up? Tell me about kind of the house you lived in. What's the house that you consider your home? And what makes it feel like home to you? Just things like that can be launching points for things that it it kind of is a way for you to extract a little bit of their testimony
Right.
without imposing your own testimony on them, without having paid into their bank first.
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I have one question about you, because
Yeah.
it just occurred to me, and I'm going to have a chance. What is you said a couple of minutes ago that you were very close to your dad.
Mm-hmm.
Can you pinpoint a moment, and maybe you can't, maybe but a moment where that relationship significantly deepened to where you could say, yeah, no, I'm really, really close now with my dad?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll tell you, it's almost a bit like faith. Like people say, well, when did you come to Jesus? Like 12 different times, and maybe different and deeper ways each time.
Yeah.
But it would be when I was, I think, 14. Still a child, obviously, but I went on a 50-mile hike with the Scouts, and the first night I got there, I discovered that my dad hadn't written me a note and tucked into my backpack without telling me about it, and in it he just acknowledged, he apologized to me for being hard on me,
Oh,
which I hadn't really considered. I mean, it was just who my dad was. He could be critical, he could be sarcastic, and I still loved him. But he said, you remind me so much of myself when I was your age, and basically I want so much better for you than I had. And it was just a moment of pretty extraordinary vulnerability for somebody who was 41 to be telling his 14-year-old son. And
wow.
I don't have the letter. It was stolen when my backpack was stolen, which is a real bummer. But it was, I think, that vulnerability that kind of drew me in more than I already had. And then he and I lived together when my parents divorced, and that was hard. It was really hard
Yeah.
but I also grew closer to him through that, and his vulnerability and saying, would you come to live with me? I don't think any of your siblings are going to want to live with me. And he was right. They didn't want to live with him. because he was hard, and not in a mean way. It was just, it's that I'm going to tell you how it is, even if it is not what you want to hear. That ultimately is very valuable. But that's a long answer to your question.
Appreciate it, because I think a lot of people want to have closer relationships with their kids, but often don't have, and they don't really know how to get there. And hearing an example of someone who got there is helpful, instructive. And what I'm hearing is there's a lot of little things, and then a few key times, and there were and vulnerability and humility on the part of the parent made a big difference.
Yeah, definitely for me, and I think that's
Okay.
informed my relationship with my kids.
All right.
Maybe specifically Sam is, I think I'm a better dad to him than I ultimately was for Marissa at the same age.
Yeah, we get better with practice.
Yeah, like a fine wine. Yeah.
So, thank you, Joe, for sharing.
Yeah. Thanks for asking.
Did you have questions about science and about Genesis? I talked about, how science is not the Bible is not anti-science, and there's a lot of scientists who are Christians. And then I kind of walked through my view of Genesis 1 and how that's not anti-science, because it deals with the evolution piece, which is, I know, huge for a lot of people.
Well,
So.
and that's what I think it's one of those things that I think is interesting as we talk about the 4Ds. I would die over this, divide over this, debate, discuss. That for me, this is a discuss topic. To me, it shouldn't eclipse death and resurrection for my sins. It's a parenthetical at the beginning, and it hasn't been a challenge to my individual faith. I know that that's not the case for everybody.
Right.
I also think that for people who want to challenge the Bible, that it is weaponized. It's a story that's weaponized because it's easy, right? It's just like, oh, well, that if you choose to take that literally, then you can just start bludgeoning people with that doesn't make any sense. Same with like the story of Lot's wife, right? I remember our mutual friend Dennis, as he was struggling with faith, he's like, help me understand this situation or whatever. And my mom has asked me similar things. And I'm like, well, ultimately I have to go back to the whole, where's Christ fit into this? And then work my way back to that and go, is this something that's really a stumbling block for me, or something that can be weaponized? And that's part of the reason we're talking about it. I don't, the term weaponized is a bit aggressive, but there are certain things that people who are counter-biblical, let's say, who want to argue against the Bible, they latch onto those things.
And Christians often don't have a good response. And so all that's left is well, I just believe it. And then they move on, and basically you've lost the argument at that point. Yeah.
Sure. It's also an argument for why we can be criticized quite accurately sometimes for a distinct lack of curiosity or understanding of our own faith, and that it's surface level, going to the parable, we are seeds planted on hard ground and not deeply. And, if our faith is challenged, do we wither or run away, or what do we do? So a lot of this series, I think, is an opportunity for us to demonstrate a degree of curiosity, to be challenged a little bit in some of our assumptions. So that's just
Because we need to have an answer. We do need, even if it's not an issue for you, you do need to have an answer.
yeah.
Because, evolution has not been a challenge for me at all. Genesis 1 has not been a challenge at all for me. As I stated on that Sunday, it's like when I came up against the issue in college, as I first began to really had to have an intellectual grounding for my faith, it was like, well, if you can make If he can make a rock, he can make a billion-year-old rock. There's no
Right.
difference to me. It's just whatever. But I know some people who, no, they have to know. And some of them are, it's a huge stumbling block. And some of them are like, if we'll go the opposite side, whether, they believe evolution, and it's like, how does the Bible, this seems to contradict the Bible. And others are going to go to the other side of it and say, if you don't have a particular view of those verses, then you don't believe in the authority of Scripture. You're just ignoring it.
Yeah.
And what I liked about, one of the reasons why I like my position among a lot of them, is it sidesteps the whole issue. It says that's not an issue. It's not the point of the text. It's just, that's not what's going on. It's not trying to answer the evolutionary question. That's not what Moses is dealing with. And it's biblical. I believe it's very biblical. So, yeah.
Well, I mentioned this to you after the service. The thing that I came away with, and it was not to be punny or anything. It was revelatory in many ways, that the way that we choose to not choose, the way that we interpret that first, the purpose of that first sentence,
Right.
dictates how the rest of that passage is read. And we are so familiar with that phrase that we cease to investigate. It's like listening to Amazing Grace. We've heard it so many times that lyrically we seldom stop and go, oh gosh, this is what they're saying.
Right.
Same thing with that first phrase. It's like, is that there were two things you...
Is it a title? Is
Right.
it a summary? Or is it something else?
Right. And the idea that it's saying, hey, this is what happened in the beginning, period. Now we're moving on to something else. Now we're moving
Right.
on to the creation of the Holy Land, or
Right.
the
The preparation of that
yeah,
plot of land for the Garden of Eden, for Adam and Eve to be there.
right. And really, that interpretation of that frees up so many other things and addresses so many other questions. Like, well, why is it only dealing with this piece of land when the earth is millions of years old or whatever? It's like, well, because that was the in the beginning part. He created all that. In the meantime, we fast forward to a period of time in which he prepared this.
Right.
And that piece only took a week.
Right. Well, and for those who are convinced that the earth is young, and okay, I mean, whether that's the case is not my point. The point is this viewpoint can support that view, because in the beginning doesn't specify a time frame. It's just as before the start of the story. That's all it means. It doesn't mean it usually doesn't mean a moment. It just means a time, which could be billions of years. It could be a month. It could be a couple of days. That's not the point. And so if you really are convinced that the earth is not as old as evolutionary scientists say, fine, but that's not the point of the text.
Yeah.
That's not the point.
I think about, like, if I'm telling my story to you and I say, when I was a kid, we lived in a lot of different places. And then I
Right.
start talking about the time when we moved to Portland in the last 20 years. That first sentence covers 39 years, or well, not even 39, 20 years or something like that. It's not the point of the rest of it. There
Right.
were a lot of things that happened in there. I did live in a bunch of different houses. I went to different
Right.
schools. We went on vacations. I have siblings. There's a whole myriad of things that I covered in that. But
Sure.
We
When
can-
I was younger, I did this.
right,
What are you talking about, right? Because that can apply to a 6-year-old, or it can apply to a 100-year-old.
yeah, right, right.
It's just that happened then, but we're focusing on this part of the story.
If you're hanging out with somebody, you and I are in our 50s, but if we're hanging out with somebody who's in their 70s, they refer to us as young'uns. And then,
Yes, they would.
and then I'm helping coach soccer, and they refer to me as that old guy, and it's like, okay, it's
Right.
it's relative.
And the biblical argument for this is that word "in the beginning," that, or the beginning of. Throughout the Old Testament, it is normally used to reference the beginning part of the reign of like a king or of a person's life. We can see that in Job, where God says the beginning of your life was okay, but the end of your life is going to be amazing, right? So that's the way it's used.
The demarcation
And then
point, yeah.
right, it just means the earlier part of your life, the earlier part. That's all it means, right? But we're so influenced by the tradition of that, as you said, and we're so influenced by, which gets really deep. We're influenced by Greek cosmology of how you're supposed to read the world, that we assume that what that's done in that verse is just make a big pile of goo that God is now molding and shaping. That's a Greek worldview. That's not necessarily a biblical worldview.
Well,
but it was extremely prevalent.
When you spoke the sermon, you were also talking about the Pentateuch.
Yes.
And I know how to spell it. I just always pronounce it differently. But the Hebrew was written to be read from what we would call the back of the book to what we call the front of the book. Well, that's just our tradition. That's our cultural
how we do it
approach to reading, where many Eastern cultures, you start here and then work your way to what we would call the front. Now, is one right and one wrong? No, just different cultures. And so our viewpoint of like what Moses has been writing for us to read is, we're trying to view that through the Western prism, again, also through the Greek prism, reflecting on the Hebrew.
That's right. And so you misread verses and words, like the phrase void and empty, that again is a Greek worldview kind of phrase. It's the same words in Hebrew are used to describe the wilderness. Void, or as in nothing, there's no one's there, and empty is in the sense, and it has to do with it's uninhabitable. So it's really not saying, and this is how this word to describe the wilderness. So it's talking about just, it's not suitable for human beings to be there. That's the point. And so what he's doing is he walks through these 6 days, is he's setting everything exactly where it is, and it pushes the question of what's happening there away from a science question to, what does this tell us about who God is? Right. What does it tell us about what his intentions for humanity is? Those are far more important questions than whether or not this is teaching evolution or not.
Right. And I think that's the other major thing that I took away was, what was the intention of the way that it was told? It wasn't intended to be a textbook explaining how the world was created, or a science text. It was told within the context of what Moses was trying to communicate. And so, if I'm, again, telling a story about growing up in the Portland area, that's not the history of Portland.
No.
There's elements of it in there and the things that happened while I'm here, but it's not the point. A historical text.
Because every storyteller leaves pieces out.
Right. Like the Gospels, right? Each of the Gospels had a particular purpose in how, and the way that it's told is that result. You still see all the overlap, but John is about divinity. And yeah,
Matthew is about that he's fulfilled the promises, and
Luke's,
Luke is trying presenting that he's human as well as divine, and it goes on down the list.
Yeah.
They're all different, and so and you have to ask that question, and the weird thing is people know this, that you don't take people out of context. You have to, if you really want to understand them, you have to ask, well, why are they saying this? What are they trying to get at? We understand this stuff, but we forget it when we come to certain texts, certain subjects, and that can get really frustrating.
Oh, it does. Yeah.
I mean,
I think it
Go ahead.
comes to some vulnerability that we live in a world now where if you seem to give in to something or even demonstrate a degree of openness to understanding something, there's a fear that you're going to get jumped on, that you're going to be attacked or whatever. And that's probably not inaccurate. However, going kind of full circle, choosing to demonstrate vulnerability actually gives you an opportunity to connect more closely with people. And it means maybe you don't win this particular debate. And why is that important when you consider the eternal promise for that person if you can connect with them?
And in two things as I'm watching our time here. One, 100%, and that was my big point on that Sunday, was just don't make this an issue. If you really need a solution, there's a couple of different options for you on the whole evolutionary piece. Whether you want to believe the young Earth version, you want to have the gap version, progressive creationism, or this view. There's so many different options, and just don't make this an issue.
Yeah.
Right. But the other thing I wanted to say was, you're right. You're going to get attacked, and the person who put forward this view, John Sailhammer, has been, because it is a very different viewpoint. And how do I say this? I'll just try and say it bluntly. The people who criticize him, I have not found one who criticizes him who has the level of credibility to do so.
Understood. Right.
Right? Because, I have a Hebrew. I have a seminary degree too. I have a master's in stuff. I studied Hebrew. I'm just as qualified as a lot of the people who are, quote, criticizing him because he's not interpreting the Hebrew right. But
that's his life's
I'm
work.
not. Yeah, that's his life's work, guys. Yeah. Do you not understand the difference here? Can you just pick up the Hebrew Bible and read it and notice all the little subtle differences and the nuances? Have you spent 50 years in the Pentateuch trying to understand the meaning of it? No. And so, yes, you can say, well, a lot of smart people disagree with him. Well, yeah, a lot of people do. Smart people do disagree with him. But just because you're super smart on something doesn't mean you're an expert in that subject.
Yeah. Or just because you're super smart in one area doesn't mean that translates to something else.
Right.
Yeah.
It just doesn't.
Yeah.
Be very careful on where your sources are, on who you criticize, because they might be really great people. They may have honest intentions. They may be very smart people, but this may not be their expertise.
Right. I think
and
of
so
myself.
Be careful.
I'm somebody that knows a lot about a little bit about a lot of things, and a lot about a few things, but not a lot about a lot of things. You get what I'm saying?
And that gets dangerous.
It is
for us.
And that's where humility is important, is to go, hey, I need to know who my trusted authorities are in these topics. And, don't lean in on your shallow understanding. Show some humility and go, I may not know this. Yeah.
Because, you may... he may be wrong. It is possible he's wrong, but you got to make you have to make a biblical argument, not a scientific argument. You need a biblical argument. And honestly, unless you unless you have high level credentials in Hebrew, boy, I'm going to take your criticism with a little grain of salt.
Yeah.
I just am. Sorry. So, yeah, it's that whole Dunning-Kruger effect. Or you know what I'm talking about?
No.
You know what I'm talking about. You don't remember that? It's that. I don't think I'm getting the first name right. It's the that people who don't know very much about a subject always overestimate their ability to understand, and people who know a lot about a subject always underestimate, because the people who know a little bit don't know what they don't know, and the people who know a lot know what they don't know.
And there's kind of a corollary to that the teachers good teachers understand, which is most teachers tend to assume that their students know more than they do. And students have a tendency to want to present that they know more than they do, which leaves a gap. So that requires humility on the part of the student and curiosity on the part of the teacher to say, do you understand this? And it's okay if you don't. It's okay if you don't. Let's, anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, because the people who know a lot assume people who don't know a lot know more than they do, because to them it's just second nature. And I deal with this. I mean, I'm not a slacker on Bible stuff. I'm pretty decent. I know there's a lot of people who know a whole lot more, but there are times in which, and I've had lots of people tell me recently, like, Brian, you got to slow down because you know this so well that I can't follow you. I'm like, oh yeah.
Right. You don't want to be condescending, and you don't want to be pedantic, and you also need to if we understand something, we need to be patient,
right,
with the necessity for people who haven't heard that. If you teach a topic the second time in 11 years, so what? We can still learn from that.
Yeah.
And somebody hasn't heard that yet.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway.
Anyways, interesting stuff. So Sunday we're going to be talking about is there one way to heaven?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. That'll be an interesting topic.
Yeah,
so.
I can see that. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us tonight, and we will hopefully see you guys on Sunday. If not, maybe next week.
All right. See you in a few days.
Thanks.